The gym smelled like old sweat and testosterone, the kind of place where egos got tested and reputations got built. It was 2200 hours at Naval Air Station Oceana, and the mixed martial arts cage in the corner of the fitness center had drawn its usual crowd of aviators and ground crew looking for entertainment after a long day of flight operations. Nobody expected what they were about to witness. Lieutenant Kira, Viper, Dalton stood 5'6" in her bare feet, a compact frame of lean muscle wrapped in a Navy issue workout shirt that had seen better days. She'd been a Navy aviator for 8 years, an FA-18 Super Hornet pilot with 3 combat deployments, and a distinguished flying cross that nobody talked about because she was a woman, and acknowledging her competence made some people uncomfortable. Tonight she'd made the mistake of accepting a sparring invitation from Lieutenant Commander Derek Vance, a TOPGUN graduate who'd been running his mouth about female pilots in the ready room for the past 3 months. The cage door clanged shut with finality. Vance outweighed her by 80 pounds, stood 6'2", and had the kind of swagger that came from never being told no. He circled her with predatory confidence while the crowd pressed against the chain link, their faces blurred shadows in the fluorescent lighting. "This is gonna be quick," someone muttered. Vance feinted left, then shot in for a takedown with the kind of speed that surprised everyone except Kira. She sprawled back, hips low, but his weight was overwhelming. Within seconds he had her back, one arm snaking around her throat in what should have been a clean rear naked choke. But something was wrong. His forearm pressed not just against her carotid arteries but directly across her windpipe, crushing her trachea with deliberate malice. This wasn't submission grappling anymore. This was something else. Kira's vision began to tunnel, not from the blood choke that would have put her to sleep safely, but from actual suffocation. She tapped frantically against his forearm, the universal signal of submission, but Vance only squeezed harder. The crowd's cheering shifted to uncertain murmurs. 5 seconds became 10. Her tapping became weaker, more desperate. In the back of the gym, near the heavy bags, a figure straightened from his workout. He'd been watching the whole thing, and what he'd just witnessed crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Master Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reaper Kincaid had 22 years in naval special warfare, a SEAL operator who'd done things in places that didn't exist on maps, and he moved with the kind of quiet purpose that made the crowd part without anyone consciously deciding to step aside. His hands were taped, knuckles wrapped from his own workout. He reached the cage in 4 strides. The door hadn't been locked because nobody expected trouble, and Reaper opened it with surgical calm, his face a mask of controlled fury that made the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. Vance was so focused on choking Kira that he didn't hear the footsteps behind him, didn't register the shift in atmosphere until a hand like a steel vise clamped onto the back of his neck, with pressure that sent lightning bolts of pain down his spine. "Release," Reaper said, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of absolute authority. Vance's grip loosened reflexively, some primal part of his brain recognizing that he was no longer the apex predator in this space. Kira gasped and rolled away, clutching her throat, coughing violently as oxygen flooded back into her lungs. The crowd had gone completely silent. Vance tried to stand, tried to salvage his dignity with some stupid comment about it being just sparring, but Reaper's hand remained on his neck, holding him in a kneeling position that looked almost penitent. "You just choked a fellow officer past submission," Reaper said, his voice still quiet, still controlled, but now carrying an edge that could cut glass. "In front of witnesses, after she tapped multiple times." The implications hung in the air like smoke. This wasn't just about a sparring match gone wrong. This was assault, potential court-martial territory, career-ending stupidity motivated by ego and something darker. Vance's face had gone pale, the swagger draining out of him like water from a broken dam. "She tapped," he started to say, trying to rewrite history in real time. "I didn't feel it, "Bullshit." The word came from Kira, who'd managed to get to her feet, one hand still on her throat, her voice raw and damaged but filled with the kind of anger that came from being underestimated one too many times. "You felt every tap, Vance. You looked me in the eye while you kept squeezing." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, because they'd all seen it too, and now they had to decide whether to be witnesses or accomplices to the lie. Reaper's grip on Vance's neck tightened imperceptibly. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his tone suggesting this wasn't a negotiation. "You're going to apologize to Lieutenant Dalton. Then you're going to walk directly to the Master-at-Arms office and report yourself for assault. And if you ever put your hands on another service member with intent to harm again, I will personally ensure that your career ends in ways that make a court-martial look merciful." The silence stretched out, broken only by the distant hum of the air conditioning and Kira's labored breathing. Vance was calculating, trying to find an angle, a way to spin this that didn't end with him in deep legal trouble. But Reaper's presence behind him and the 40 witnesses surrounding the cage made it clear that spin wasn't going to save him this time. "I apologize," Vance finally muttered, the words bitter on his tongue. "Louder," Reaper instructed, "and look at her when you say it." Vance's jaw clenched, but he raised his eyes to meet Kira's, and what he saw there made him flinch. Not fear, not submission, but the cold assessment of a combat aviator who'd made life-and-death decisions at Mach 1.5 and found him utterly lacking. "I apologize, Lieutenant Dalton. I was out of line." Kira nodded once, sharp and dismissive, then turned and walked out of the gym with her head high, refusing to show weakness even though her throat felt like it had been crushed in a vice. The crowd parted for her the way they had for Reaper, but for different reasons. They were starting to understand that they just witnessed something significant, a line being drawn in the sand about respect and conduct, and the consequences of letting ego override honor. Reaper released Vance and stepped back, his expression still unreadable. "Get moving," he said. "You've got an appointment with the MAA, and I'll be right behind you to ensure you actually show up." Vance stumbled out of the cage, his earlier confidence completely shattered, and headed for the door with the posture of a man walking to his execution. The crowd began to disperse, conversations starting in low murmurs, everyone processing what they'd just seen and what it meant. But Reaper stood alone in the cage for a moment longer, looking at the mat where Kira had nearly been choked unconscious, and his hands clenched into fists. He'd seen a lot of violence in his career, had participated in operations that would never be declassified. But there was something particularly ugly about watching a fellow service member abuse their physical advantage against someone who'd already proven themselves in ways that mattered. He'd heard about Lieutenant Dalton before tonight, had read the classified after-action reports from her deployment to the Persian Gulf, where she'd provided close air support that had saved a SEAL team pinned down in hostile territory. The irony wasn't lost on him. He left the gym and headed for the MAA office, not to babysit Vance, but to ensure that proper procedures were followed, and that this incident didn't get swept under the rug the way too many things did when careers and reputations were on the line. The night air was cool against his skin, salt breeze coming off the Atlantic, and he took a moment to center himself before walking into the administrative building. Inside, Vance was already stuttering through an explanation to the duty MAA, a senior chief who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else but was taking notes with professional detachment. Reaper added his statement, factual and precise, describing exactly what he'd witnessed and the timeline of events. The senior chief's expression grew darker with each detail. "Lieutenant Commander Vance will be restricted to base pending investigation," the senior chief said, his tone making it clear this was serious. "Master Chief, I'll need you to remain available for formal questioning tomorrow." Reaper nodded and left, his job done for now, though he knew this was far from over. He thought about Lieutenant Dalton, wondered if she was okay, if she needed medical attention for her throat. He'd seen the bruising already starting to form, the red marks that would turn purple by morning. But he also knew that type of officer, the kind who'd rather suffer in silence than show vulnerability, and he respected that even as he worried about it. The next morning would bring consequences, official inquiries, and the uncomfortable reckoning that happened when the facade of professional conduct cracked open. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, Reaper went back to his quarters and lay in his rack, staring at the ceiling, thinking about honor and respect, and the fragile ecosystem of military culture that allowed both excellence and abuse to coexist in the same institution. He'd been in the Navy long enough to know that one incident wouldn't change everything, but he also believed that small stands against injustice accumulated over time, building towards something better. Or at least that's what he told himself in the darkness, listening to the distant sound of jets taking off for night operations, the thunder of afterburners, a reminder that the mission always continued, regardless of the human drama playing out on the ground. The investigation moved forward with bureaucratic efficiency, statements taken, witnesses interviewed, medical documentation of Kira's injuries compiled into official reports. Lieutenant Commander Vance tried to mount a defense based on misunderstanding and training intensity, but the physical evidence and witness testimony made his position untenable. Within a week, he was facing a court-martial for assault, his TOPGUN credentials and spotless record suddenly irrelevant in the face of documented misconduct. The story spread through the naval aviation community like wildfire, whispered conversations in ready rooms and officers' clubs, a cautionary tale about ego and consequences. But the real story, the one that mattered more than Vance's downfall, was about Lieutenant Kira Dalton, and the moment when someone had finally stood up for her in a way that couldn't be ignored or minimized. Reaper's intervention had been captured on the gym's security cameras, grainy footage that became unofficial evidence of what happened when predatory behavior met immovable principle. Kira spent 3 days with a damaged throat, speaking in a rasp that made radio communications difficult, but she refused to ground herself despite medical advice. She had a training sortie scheduled with a new pilot fresh out of flight school, a kid named Ensign Jake Martinez who was nervous and eager in equal measure. She met him at the squadron paraloft, her voice still rough, and saw the concern in his eyes when he heard her speak. "Ma'am, are you sure you should be flying?" He asked, genuine worry overriding military protocol. She gave him a look that could have melted steel. "Ensign, when I can't fly anymore, I'll let you know. Until then, suit up and try to keep up." They flew a basic air combat maneuvering training mission, and Kira proceeded to teach him lessons about fighter tactics that no textbook could convey. Her flying was surgical precise, every input calculated for maximum effect. Martinez found himself consistently outmaneuvered, his FA-18 pushed into defensive positions by an opponent who seemed to anticipate his moves before he made them. When they landed and debriefed, he was sweating and humbled, but also energized by the experience of flying against someone who was genuinely better. "How did you do that?" he asked, reviewing the HUD tape that showed Kira's Super Hornet executing a high-G barrel roll that had positioned her perfectly for a gun kill. She smiled, the first real smile she'd managed since the incident in the gym. "Practice, Ensign, and refusing to let anyone tell me I don't belong here." The words carried weight that Martinez didn't fully understand yet, but would come to appreciate as he learned more about the woman who just handed him his ass in a training engagement. That evening, Reaper found Kira in the squadron-ready room, reviewing mission briefs for the next day's operations. The room was empty except for them, the fluorescent lighting harsh against the gray walls covered in squadron patches and photographs of aviators past and present. He knocked on the doorframe even though the door was open, military courtesy automatic after decades of service. "Got a minute, Lieutenant?" he asked. She looked up, surprised to see him, then nodded and gestured to the chair across from her. "Master Chief, I was hoping I'd run into you before you rotated out." He sat down, his posture relaxed but alert, the body language of someone who was comfortable in any environment. "How's the throat?" Direct question, no dancing around the subject, which she appreciated. "Hurts like hell," she admitted, "but I'll live. Doctor says the damage is superficial, should heal completely in a couple weeks. Reaper nodded, studying her face, seeing the determination behind the pain. What you did, staying on flight status despite medical advice, some people would call that stupid. She met his eyes, unflinching. And what would you call it, Master Chief? A slight smile crossed his weathered face. I'd call it exactly what a SEAL would do. Mission first, ego never, but also never letting the bastards see you bleed. The compliment was unexpected, coming from someone like him, and she felt something unclench in her chest. Thank you, she said quietly, for what you did in the gym. Nobody's ever. She trailed off, not sure how to finish the sentence, how to articulate years of fighting alone. Reaper shook his head. Don't thank me for doing what should have been done from the start. Every person in that gym should have stepped in the second. Vance went too far. The fact that they didn't, that they were willing to watch you get hurt for their entertainment, that's the real problem. His words cut to the heart of something Kira had been feeling for years but couldn't quite articulate. The loneliness of being different in a culture that valued conformity, the exhaustion of constantly having to prove herself worthy of basic respect. It's always been like this, she said, her voice still rough. Since flight school, every squadron, every deployment, always having to be twice as good to be considered half as competent. Reaper leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. I've got a daughter, he said, seemingly changing the subject. She's 14, wants to be a naval aviator just like her old man, except she's smarter than I ever was, better at math, better at spatial reasoning, just better. And she asks me sometimes if it's worth it, if she'll have to fight the same battles you're fighting. He paused, his jaw tight. I want to tell her it'll be different, that the Navy is changing, that respect is earned through competence and character. But then I see shit like what happened in that gym, and I realize we've still got a long way to go. Kira felt an unexpected kinship with this battle-hardened SEAL who'd probably killed more people than she'd ever meet, because beneath the tactical expertise and physical prowess was someone who understood what it meant to care about something bigger than yourself. Tell your daughter it's worth it, Kira said, her damaged voice carrying conviction despite its weakness. Tell her that flying is the most beautiful and terrible thing she'll ever do, and that every time she straps into a cockpit, she'll be proving that capability doesn't care about chromosomes. Tell her that it's hard and lonely, and sometimes people will try to break her just because they can. But also tell her that there are people like you who'll stand up when it matters, and that's worth fighting for. Reaper's eyes were suspiciously bright in the harsh lighting, and he nodded slowly. I'll tell her that, and I'll tell her about you, if that's okay. About the lieutenant who got choked in a gym and then flew a training sortie 3 days later because she refused to be grounded by someone else's cruelty. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two warriors from different communities finding common ground in the struggle for dignity and excellence. Then Reaper stood, extending his hand. Fair winds and following seas, Lieutenant Dalton. And if you ever need anything, ever find yourself in a situation where the system fails you, you call me. He produced a business card with a phone number and nothing else, the kind of contact information that bypassed official channels. She took it, understanding the significance, the unspoken promise of protection from someone who had the power and connections to make problems disappear. Thank you, Master Chief, and tell your daughter that Lieutenant Kira Dalton says she's got this. He smiled, the expression transforming his usually severe features into something almost gentle, then left the ready room with the same quiet purpose he did everything. Kira sat alone in the ready room for a long time after he left, turning the business card over in her fingers, thinking about courage and allyship, and the unexpected ways that support manifested in military culture. The court-martial proceeded with predictable results. Lieutenant Commander Vance was convicted of assault, reduced in rank, and given a punitive discharge that ended his military career with the kind of permanent stain that would follow him into civilian life. Some people thought the punishment was too harsh for a sparring incident gone wrong, but those people hadn't seen the security footage or read the medical reports, or understood that what happened in that gym was part of a larger pattern of behavior that the Navy could no longer tolerate. Kira was called to testify, had to sit in front of a panel of senior officers and describe in clinical detail what it felt like to be choked past submission while people watched. It was humiliating and necessary in equal measure, another performance of competence and composure that women in the military were expected to deliver without complaint. But this time felt different, because when she finished her testimony, the presiding officer, a female captain with 30 years of service, looked at her with something approaching solidarity and said, "Thank you for your service and your courage, Lieutenant Dalton. This court is adjourned." The words were standard, but the tone carried meaning that transcended official procedure, an acknowledgement that speaking truth in institutional settings required its own kind of bravery. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited with cameras and questions, because the story had leaked beyond military channels and become a symbol for larger conversations about military culture and gender integration and accountability. Kira refused all interviews, walking past them with the same blank expression she wore during carrier landings, letting her public affairs officer handle the media circus with practiced deflection. She didn't want to be a symbol or a spokesperson. She just wanted to fly, to do the job she'd trained for without it becoming a referendum on whether women belonged in combat aviation. But life rarely gave you what you wanted, only what you could handle, and Kira was learning to handle more than she'd ever thought possible. Back at Oceana, things shifted in subtle ways. The younger pilots, especially the women, started looking at her differently, with something approaching reverence mixed with relief that someone had finally pushed back successfully against the casual cruelty that too often passed for military tradition. The older generation was more complicated. Some respected her for not backing down. Others resented her for making waves that threatened comfortable patterns of behavior. But there was a new caution in how people interacted with her, a recognition that Lieutenant Kira Dalton wasn't someone who could be intimidated or dismissed anymore. She'd been tested in ways that had nothing to do with flying skill, and she'd survived with her integrity intact. That mattered more than any medal. 3 months after the incident, Kira was in the squadron-ready room preparing for a night training mission when the commanding officer called her into his office. Captain James Wheeler was old-school Navy, a former F-14 pilot who transitioned to Super Hornets when the Tomcat was retired, and his opinion carried weight throughout the air wing. She stood at attention in front of his desk, wondering if this was another administrative headache, another consequence of being the lieutenant who'd made waves. But Wheeler gestured for her to sit, his expression unreadable behind steel-rimmed glasses that reflected the fluorescent lighting. "Lieutenant Dalton," he began, then paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "I've been reviewing your record. 3 deployments, 78 combat sorties, a DFC for close air support that saved 12 SEALs and multiple air medals. Your flight evaluations are consistently above average. Your tactical knowledge is exceptional, and your judgment under pressure is exactly what I want in my squadron." He paused again, and Kira felt her heart rate increase, not from fear but from the surreal nature of hearing her accomplishments catalogued by someone who'd rarely acknowledged her existence. "I'm recommending you for TOPGUN," Wheeler said flatly. The words hit her like a missile impact, completely unexpected and potentially life-changing. TOPGUN, the Naval Strike and Air Warfare Center, was the apex of fighter pilot training, the elite school where the best of the best learned to be better. It was also a deeply conservative institution that had only recently begun accepting women, and the washout rate was legendary. "Sir," she managed, her damaged voice still carrying a rasp that made her sound dangerous, "I'm honored, but—" Wheeler held up a hand. "No buts, Lieutenant. You've earned this opportunity through performance, not politics. I don't care what happened in the gym or what some people think about female aviators. I care about combat effectiveness, and you're one of the most combat-effective pilots I've got." He leaned forward, his expression intense. "But I need to be honest with you. TOPGUN is going to be harder for you than for anyone else. Because you're not good enough, you are, but because you'll be under a microscope every single day, with people waiting for you to fail so they can use it as evidence that women don't belong there. You'll have to be perfect when everyone else just has to be good. The brutal honesty was almost refreshing after years of coded language and diplomatic deflection. "I can handle it, sir," Kira said, meaning every word, feeling the fire in her gut that had kept her going through every obstacle and setback. Wheeler smiled, the expression rare enough that she almost didn't recognize it. "I know you can. That's why I'm recommending you. Class starts in 3 months. Use that time to prepare physically and mentally, because once you get to Fallen, it's going to be the hardest thing you've ever done." She left his office in a daze, the reality of the opportunity slowly sinking in. TOPGUN. The school she dreamed about since flight school, the ultimate validation that she belonged among the elite. But Wheeler's words echoed in her mind: "You'll have to be perfect when everyone else just has to be good." It wasn't fair, wasn't right, but it was reality, and she'd learned a long time ago that complaining about fairness was a waste of energy better spent on preparation and execution. She spent the next 3 months training with monastic intensity, flying every possible sortie, studying tactical manuals until she could recite them from memory, running and lifting and pushing her body to its physical limits. She consulted with other TOPGUN graduates, picked their brains about tactics and techniques, and what to expect from the instructors who'd be evaluating her every move. Some were helpful, offering legitimate advice about air combat maneuvering and weapons employment theory. Others were dismissive, suggesting she was wasting her time, that she'd wash out within the first few weeks like the other women who'd tried and failed. She ignored the negativity, filed away the useful information, and kept pushing. Reaper called her once during this period, checking in like the protective mentor he'd inadvertently become. "Heard you got selected for TOPGUN," he said, his voice carrying approval across the phone line. "That's outstanding, you're going to kick ass." She laughed, the sound still slightly raspy though her throat had mostly healed. "That's the plan, Master Chief, though I'm told I need to be perfect rather than just good." There was a pause, then Reaper's voice came back harder, more serious. "Fuck perfect. Perfect is the enemy of good enough. You know what SEALs learn in Bud S? That the only easy day was yesterday, and that competence under pressure is more important than flawless execution in controlled environments. TOPGUN is going to throw situations at you that don't have perfect solutions. Your job isn't to be perfect, it's to make the best decision possible with the information available and then execute with commitment. That's what warriors do." His words settled something in her chest, a reminder that she'd already proven herself in combat, that TOPGUN was just another challenge in a career built on overcoming challenges. "Thanks, Master Chief. I needed to hear that." They talked for another few minutes about nothing in particular, the easy conversation of people who understood each other's world, then said goodbye with promises to stay in touch. Kira hung up feeling more centered, more ready for what was coming. The day she left for Naval Air Station Fallen in Nevada, her squadron threw her a small send-off in the ready room. Nothing fancy, just coffee and donuts, and a few speeches from senior officers who'd barely acknowledged her existence before the gym incident, but now wanted to claim credit for her success. She accepted their words with professional grace, understanding that this was how institutions worked, how people rewritten history to align with current narratives. But the moment that mattered came after the official ceremony, when Ensign Martinez, the kid she'd trained with, pulled her aside with shy determination. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say thank you," he stammered, "for showing me what right looks like. I know I've got a long way to go, but flying against you taught me more about being a fighter pilot than anything else." Kira felt unexpected emotion well up, because this was why the struggle mattered, why refusing to quit or compromise created ripples that extended beyond her own career. "Keep studying, keep practicing, and never let anyone convince you that competence is negotiable," she told him. "You've got good instincts, Ensign. Trust them." He nodded, then surprised her by coming to attention and rendering a sharp salute, the kind of respect that couldn't be faked or commanded, only earned through demonstrated excellence. She returned the salute, then grabbed her sea bag and headed for the door, ready for the next chapter. Fallen was everything she'd imagined, and worse, a harsh desert environment where temperatures could swing 40 degrees between day and night, where the flying was relentless and the instruction was brutal in its honesty. The TOPGUN class consisted of 16 aircrew, and Kira was the only woman. She felt the eyes on her from day one, the assessment and skepticism, the waiting for failure. But she'd been here before in other contexts, and she knew the only response was to let her performance speak. The academic portion was intense, classes on tactics and threat analysis and weapons employment that assumed you already had a graduate-level understanding of fighter aviation. She absorbed the information like a sponge, taking notes and asking sharp questions that demonstrated she belonged in the room. The flying was where things got real. TOPGUN instructors were the best pilots in the Navy, and they didn't go easy on students. They pushed you into situations where you had to make split-second decisions with incomplete information, where any mistake could result in a simulated kill that would be dissected mercilessly in the debrief afterward. Kira flew against aircraft that represented every potential threat the Navy might face: adversary fighters flown by instructors who'd studied enemy tactics and knew how to exploit every weakness. She got shot down, metaphorically, more times than she could count in those first few weeks. But she learned from every engagement, adapted her tactics, studied her mistakes with clinical detachment. The other students formed into informal partnerships, sharing notes and tactics, helping each other prepare for flights. Kira was initially excluded from these groups, not overtly but through the subtle social mechanisms that enforced conformity. But she didn't let it bother her, focused instead on building her own knowledge base, on becoming so competent that partnership with her would be desired rather than avoided. The breakthrough came during a complex training mission in the 4th week. The scenario involved defending a high-value target against multiple adversary aircraft, a situation where coordination and tactical innovation were essential. Kira was paired with another student, a lieutenant named Marcus Hayes, who made it clear he thought women in combat aviation were a diversity initiative rather than operational necessity. They briefed the mission with professional coldness, both understanding that personal feelings had to be subordinate to mission success. In the air, things went wrong fast. The adversary aircraft were aggressive and skilled, exploiting gaps in their defensive formation, threatening to penetrate to the target before Kira and Hayes could react. Standard defensive tactics weren't working, and Kira made a split-second decision to try something unconventional, a vertical offset that would put her above and behind the adversary formation, trading energy for position, sacrificing immediate defensive capability for the potential of a decisive counterattack. It was risky, left Hayes temporarily alone against multiple threats, and violated the standard defensive game plan they'd briefed. But Kira's instincts told her it was the right move, and she committed fully, pulling her Super Hornet into a climbing spiral that bled airspeed but gained altitude. For 10 seconds, she was completely vulnerable, watching her airspeed indicator drop toward stall speed while adversary aircraft closed on Hayes below. Then she was at the apex, inverting and rolling into a dive that accelerated her aircraft back into the fight, but now with perfect position on the adversary formation that hadn't expected a threat from above. She pickled off simulated missiles at 2 targets, called Fox 3, over the radio with clinical precision, then continued her dive into a gun's position on a 3rd adversary that was threatening Hayes. The TOPGUN instructor flying the adversary aircraft never saw her coming, and his aircraft's warning systems didn't alert him until Kira was already in a gun kill position, simulated bullets finding his jet in the training simulation. "Kill, kill, kill," she called over the radio, the standard call for a gun's engagement. The instructor acknowledged with grudging respect in his voice, then broke off the engagement according to training rules. Hayes took advantage of the chaos Kira had created to engage the remaining adversaries, and together they successfully defended the target, though both their aircraft were simulated damaged in the process. The debrief afterward was intense. The lead instructor, Commander Rick Stone Morrison, was a legendary FA-18 pilot with combat experience going back to the First Gulf War, and he ran debriefs with the same intensity he flew. He pulled up the mission tape, showing the tactical picture from God's eye view, tracking each aircraft's movement through the engagement. When he got to Kira's decision to go vertical, he paused the video and looked directly at her. "Lieutenant Dalton, talk me through your thought process here," he said, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. Kira stood and walked to the screen, using a laser pointer to trace her aircraft's path. "Sir, we were getting overwhelmed by the adversary numbers, and standard defensive tactics were failing because they had energy and position advantage. I assessed that our best chance was to sacrifice immediate defensive capability for positional advantage, using vertical space that the adversaries weren't covering." Morrison nodded. "And the risk of leaving your wingman alone against multiple threats." She met his eyes without flinching. "Calculated and acceptable, sir. Lieutenant Hayes is a capable pilot who could handle temporary solo defense while I maneuvered for the counterattack. The alternative was a slow defeat as we got picked apart by superior numbers." There was silence in the room as Morrison considered her answer, and Kira could feel the other students' attention on her, waiting to see if she'd be validated or torn apart. Then Morrison smiled, a rare expression that transformed his severe features. "Outstanding. You identified that the defensive fight was unwinnable, adapted tactics on the fly, and executed with commitment despite the risk. That's exactly the kind of decision-making we're trying to teach here." He turned to the rest of the class. "Notice that Lieutenant Dalton didn't ask for permission or wait for approval. She saw an opportunity, assessed the risk, and took action. That's what we need in combat pilots who can think independently and make tactical decisions under pressure." He clicked to the next part of the tape, showing Kira's attack from above. The execution was clean, energy management was perfect, and the result was neutralizing 3 adversary aircraft and enabling mission success. This is an excellent example of tactical innovation within doctrinal framework. The debrief continued, but something had shifted in the room, a recognition that Kira wasn't just a competent pilot but someone who could think at the tactical level required for TOPGUN graduation. After the debrief, Hayes approached her in the hallway, his expression uncomfortable but determined. "That was good flying," he said, the words clearly costing him something. "I was wrong about you." Kira studied him for a moment, seeing genuine contrition behind the awkward apology. "Thanks," she said simply, not making it easier for him but not making it harder either. "Maybe next time we fly together, we start with the assumption that we're both here to learn rather than to prove gender politics one way or another." Hayes nodded, relieved that she wasn't going to make a big deal out of it. "Deal." They walked toward the next briefing together, not quite friends but no longer adversaries, just 2 pilots trying to survive the crucible of TOPGUN training. The rest of the course was brutal but manageable. Kira continued to excel in academics, scoring in the top 3 students consistently. Her flying improved with each sortie, as she absorbed the lessons from instructors who were generous with their knowledge once you proved you were willing to learn. She still faced skepticism and occasional hostility, still had to be better than good enough. But something fundamental had changed after that vertical attack debrief. She demonstrated tactical innovation and sound judgment under pressure, and that earned respect in a culture that valued competence above all else. She graduated TOPGUN, ranked 2nd in her class, losing the top spot by a fraction of a point to a pilot who'd been flying Super Hornets for 2 years longer than her. The graduation ceremony was low-key, just a simple presentation of completion certificates and the TOPGUN patch that marked you as an elite naval aviator. But for Kira, it was vindication of every difficult choice, every moment of doubt, every time someone had suggested she wasn't good enough. She was now Lieutenant Kira Viper Dalton, TOPGUN graduate, and that meant something that transcended gender politics or institutional bias. She returned to her squadron at Oceana with new tactical knowledge and a reputation that preceded her. The younger pilots looked at her with undisguised admiration, the older generation with grudging respect. She was assigned additional responsibilities as a tactics instructor, teaching what she'd learned at TOPGUN to squadron pilots who'd never have the opportunity to attend. She took the role seriously, running training missions with the same intensity Morrison had brought to her TOPGUN flights, pushing her students to think tactically rather than just mechanically. One evening, 6 months after returning from TOPGUN, Kira was in her apartment off base when her phone rang with an unknown number. She almost didn't answer, exhausted from a day of training flights, but something made her pick up. "Lieutenant Dalton," she said, her voice carrying automatic professional inflection. "Viper, it's Reaper." The familiar voice of Master Chief Kincaid was welcome and unexpected in equal measure. "Master Chief, been a while, how's your daughter?" There was a smile in his voice when he answered. "She's good. Just got accepted to the Naval Academy class of 2030. Says she's going to be a pilot like you." Kira felt emotion swell in her chest, the realization that her career had become a reference point for the next generation. "That's outstanding. Tell her I said congratulations and that she's going to do great." They chatted for a few more minutes about trivial things, the easy conversation of people who'd formed an unlikely friendship based on mutual respect. Then Reaper's tone shifted, became more serious. "Listen, I'm calling because I heard something through the grapevine that you should know about. There's talk of you being put forward for a test pilot program. Some admiral saw your TOPGUN record and thinks you'd be perfect for evaluating new weapons systems and aircraft modifications." Kira sat up straighter, her exhaustion forgot. "Test pilot, that would be incredible. Do you know anything more specific?" Reaper laughed. "This is the Navy, Viper. Everything is rumor and speculation until it shows up in official orders. But I wanted you to hear it from someone who has your best interests in mind rather than through the rumor mill where it'll get distorted. Keep flying like you've been flying. Keep being excellent. An opportunity will find you." They said goodbye with promises to stay in touch, and Kira sat in her apartment long after the call ended, thinking about trajectories and opportunities, and the strange ways that careers unfolded. Test pilot would be another challenge, another opportunity to prove herself. But more than that, it would be a chance to contribute to the evolution of naval aviation, to have input on the weapons and systems that future pilots would use in combat. The call from Reaper proved prescient. 3 weeks later, Kira received official orders to the Naval Air Warfare Center at Patuxent River, Maryland, to attend the test pilot school. It was another elite training program, different from TOPGUN but equally demanding, focused on engineering analysis and scientific method rather than tactics and combat employment. She would spend a year learning to evaluate aircraft performance, to test new systems and weapons, to bridge the gap between engineering theory and operational reality. The orders came with a promotion to lieutenant commander, recognition of her increasing seniority and value to the Navy. She pinned on the new rank with quiet satisfaction, no ceremony or fanfare. The night before she left Oceana for Patuxent River, the squadron threw her another send-off, this one more genuine than the first had been. Wheeler, her commanding officer, presented her with a squadron plaque engraved with her call sign in combat missions. "You've set a standard that this squadron will remember for a long time," he said, his gruff voice carrying genuine pride. "Don't forget where you came from when you're flying experimental aircraft and hanging out with the engineering nerds." She laughed, accepting the plaque with gratitude. "Not a chance, sir. Once a fleet pilot, always a fleet pilot." The next morning, she drove north on I-95 toward Maryland, watching the Virginia coastline disappear in her rearview mirror, heading toward another challenge, another opportunity to prove that competence and character mattered more than demographics or tradition. Test pilot school was everything Reaper and others had warned her about: academically brutal, focused on mathematics and engineering that pushed her understanding to its limits. But it also opened up new perspectives on aviation, teaching her to think about aircraft not just as weapons platforms, but as complex systems that could be understood, evaluated, and improved. She flew aircraft she'd never imagined being in experimental prototypes, modified trainers,